too bad?
Yeah, I think we'll kick off. I think there's a fair few people online, so most people will view online. So thanks so much, Mary, for coming and talking to us today about equitable partnership in global health research. So I'll let you kick off.
Hello, everyone. I think those of you online probably might not be able to see, but we're a small group here in person. But I'm going to crack on anyway. I'm pretty comfortable with that. So my name is Mary Ryan. I am the International Research Development Manager here at the University of Glasgow. And essentially that means that my job is to make the university the best possible environment for any of our colleagues who want to collaborate with partners that are based in low and middle income countries. This takes the form of helping people find funding. It takes the form of being annoying in grant application processes, which I'll get to in a little bit. It takes the form of trying to shift the way our processes work here at the university to make them more flexible for when we're working with partners whose systems don't work the way that ours work. And today I'm going to be giving a very brief overview of some of the ideas that we've been working on in the community of researchers here at the University of Glasgow who work in this space, of which there are about 800, on equitable partnerships and how they apply in a global health context. Come in. So what I'm going to go over today is kind of mapped out there. This is not going to take up the full hour, so if people have questions, that's definitely okay. We'll have plenty of time. I'll just give a brief overview of what we mean by equitable partnership in this particular context. I'll talk through some of the structural inequalities that we see that can make it difficult to actually embed equitable partnership in practical working. And then I'll talk through some of the mechanics and the practicalities at each of the different stages of the research journey that our community mapped out. Then there's a few odds and ends that kind of didn't quite fit within any of those clear elements, and I'll talk a little bit about money at the very, very end. I think an important thing to keep in mind, though, is that I'm not here to tell you how to do things. And there is no one right way to do any of these elements. What I am here to do is try to provide support and resources and information for you as you grapple with, and the researchers that you support grapple with, what are really thorny, difficult questions and issues in a wide variety of different contexts, because all of these different elements will and should be context specific. So what I have up there on the screen is a picture of a diagnostic room in Engelan Hospital in northern Tanzania. It's obviously a very different kind of space than you'd see if you walked into your GP here in Glasgow. And the differences in those contexts are really underpin why it's important to think critically about your concepts of what equity looks like, but also your concepts of what normal looks like. So this is not coming from inside my brain. It does come from quite a bit of my own experience working with members of the research community. But essentially what I'm doing is pulling out various bits and pieces from two guidance documents, for lack of a better term, that were co-created with members of the University of Glasgow research and research development community over the past couple of years. One is a guide to ethical challenges in international research. So that is a piece that recognizes that putting in your ethical approval documents through our ethical committees and things like that is one part of doing ethical work, but it's much broader than that. And some of the things that you grapple with are outside of those systems. I'll talk about some of them today. We also had a piece of work that was just finished up last year, which is the Guide to Sustainable and Equitable Research. And that is a piece of work that recognizes we learned a lot during the travel lockdowns during COVID-19 about how to do equitable research well when we're not actually flying and being able to be face-to-face. And while those face-to-face interactions are still really an important part of those relationships, it's important to recognize that there are different ways that we can be doing research while still doing it equitably. So I'm really just pulling on those resources. So what is equitable partnership? The first thing to keep in mind is it doesn't necessarily mean equal. It doesn't necessarily mean everyone or every institution in a partnership getting exactly the same thing. It considers the structural inequalities and the power dynamics that underpin a lot of the challenges that create difficulties when doing development research and global health research well. Recognizes that increased time and effort is required. International partnerships are hard. International partnerships where there are extreme power dynamics are even harder. the time and effort it takes to try to push against a lot of those prevailing currents to create equity in partnerships takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of effort, both mental, sometimes physical, in terms of the toll it takes you when you're staying up late to be on a call at a time that is useful for somebody on the other side of the world. There are lots of different ways it takes more time and effort. But it emphasizes transparency and, that continuous interrogation of what our assumptions are about what's normal and how things should work. The way we do things here at the University of Glasgow is only one way to do them. It probably won't be the way we're doing them 10 years from now. It wasn't the way we were doing them 10 years ago. And that should always be changing. This isn't the only way to do things. It's certainly not the right way to do things. There are lots of right ways to do things. And so it removes that idea that there's a preconception about what is normal. Normal is context specific and will depend on how you're working, where you're working, and what the context is. And it's embedded throughout the partnership. It's not just about when you get the money, you'll do that stuff, which is a common challenge that I see emerging as partnerships move along the pipeline. There's a tendency to, we'll worry about that when we get the money. By that point, it's too late. So what we have on the website for that ethical guidance is that participation in equitable partnership is predicated on mutual respect, understanding, and ongoing informed consent to continued involvement. And hopefully, if you're able to develop those kinds of relationships and maintain them, you'll end up with pictures like this, which is a snapshot in time of the Supporting the National Action Plan for Antimicrobial Resistance in Tanzania team, or SNAP-AMR. That is probably, at this point in time, that represents maybe the midpoint on their journey. A lot of work developing what was needed to support that national action plan, working with local stakeholders, working with governments to identify what was required, to getting together and the project that actually ran, and now they're in the stage of the work is continuing with offshoot projects and follow-on projects. And so pictures can capture what equitable partnership maybe looks like at a point in time, but it's really what happens around that and where that is in the timeline that helps you figure out whether or not it can be a successful research project. That doesn't necessarily mean it's equitable. And pictures like this, of course, don't tell the whole story. You need a lot more information to understand whether or not the activity is still going on because they like working with each other and it is an equitable partnership and they've maintained those links to today. So if we take a step back for a moment and think about where does funding for global health research come from? I've popped up sort of our main funders here at the University of Glasgow for where our money for global health work comes from. It's NIHR, it's UKRI, generally speaking, it's the Medical Research Council, it's Wellcome, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the National Institutes of Health in the United States, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and Horizon Europe. There are no African funders in there. There are no Latin American funders in there. There are no Southeast Asian funders in there. Those are UK and American funders and Europe, I guess, as well. And so when you think about who is setting the agenda for deciding what calls are going to be posted, who's setting the rules for how that funding is going to be allocated, how it needs to be evidenced, who is making the decisions about where the money will go, decisions are made by the people who are in the room. And when you think about global health research funding and who's in the room making those decisions, you can look at where those funders are based, and it gives you a pretty good sense of who's setting the priorities and who's setting the direction of travel. And the money may flow, but power doesn't, was I thought something really powerful that was said by a representative from Oxfam a few years ago in a meeting that I was in. And it's very true, money can flow, but decision making often is a concentration of power that not a lot of people get to be in those rooms. And so when you're thinking about your research and taking it forward and applying for funding from any one of these sources, those structural inequalities about who owns the power and who makes the decisions are slightly baked in right from the start. And it has created a lot of conditions and requirements that are very much grounded in a global north approach to both legal processes, financial processes, and what is normal in the context of research relationships. We see them kind of bottoming out or becoming very apparent, coming to the surface around these three particular issues that I've pulled out. One is due diligence, the requirement that almost every funder now has for us to conduct due diligence checks on any partners that we work with, regardless of, what the nature of the funding is or how much it is. That is a requirement that is put onto us. And we have not historically, and I say historically a bit loosely because these are relatively new requirements for us. They came in with the Global Challenges Research Fund in about 2018. But we didn't do a very good job. I say we, I mean the University of Glasgow and our staff, I mean other universities in the UK, about explaining to our partners, several of whom we had worked with for quite a long time, that now we need to do this check on you. And we didn't explain it's not a test, you can't fail, but it is a requirement that we have. And if you ask us to provide the same information about all of your governance documents, all of your financial policies, all of your structures, we will provide that as well. So we're trying to get better at that. But that requirement is a top-down, we have to do it, anyone that gets funding has to do it. The second element we see coming through a lot is eligible costs. I haven't worked so much in South America and Southeast Asia, but in Africa, per diems are standard and expected and a normal part of working culture. And it's not just the Global South. I worked for the federal government in Canada, and they would never ask me for a receipt for a sandwich I bought while on a field trip. They gave me my per diem, and they don't want to know about the details. It was less work. But in the UK, most of tax law is designed to make it very difficult to be able to claim that kind of expenditure in a nonprofit organization. I can't remember all the details, but it does have to do with the tax laws in the UK, that most research expenditure, almost all, to be honest, has to be evidence, so there's no per diems. The other thing that we see coming through is who gets overheads. In the UK, there's a very complex track formula that is used to calculate based on everything from how many staff are involved to how much area our buildings take up, that gives a very specific calculation for what it costs for us to do research. And then we get a very specific formula that tells us how much we can ask for funders, 80% FEC versus 100% FEC. For most of our LMIC partners, it's just a straight, you can ask for 10% for your overheads. You can ask for 30% for your overheads. And funders that I have engaged with have been fairly open about the fact that they came up with those numbers based on some estimates, and now they're baked into most calls. And when our Global South partners do their own calculations to calculate what their overheads are, they don't line up with what these, boxy figures are that funders impose upon them. So it makes it very challenging for them to recoup all of the costs. And I can tell you that regardless of what you think about what's happening with the UK higher education sector at the moment financially, our Global South partners are in much stricter financial situations than we are, just as a norm. And then the third element there is evidencing expenditure. So that kind of ties into that per diem question, but also what is normal about, what the funders expect in terms of that audit trail, and whether or not our partners have the systems in place that not just funders expect, that we have come to expect. Are you going to be able to scan in all of your receipts and send them to us if we give you payments in advance? What are the barriers to collection of receipts? If you are paying an administrative fee in a village to cross a roadblock that is community run, and you ask for a receipt, you can try that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And if you write your own receipt and you write it in English and you ask someone to sign, can they read? Can they read English? You're asking them to put their signature on a document, assuming an awful lot of things about what they are understanding that you're asking them for. And what are the resourcing requirements that go alongside of that? Often the funder terms and conditions are very much designed around the way we do things in the UK, not around our low and middle income country partners, which is where a lot of the expenditure is when you're talking about global health research. So there's a first question for people here in the room and online about, do you have a strong understanding of what the implications are of these components for your project delivery, both for your own information and how much you can engage with your research team, but do you know enough about them to have a frank conversation with your partners about what the implications are of these elements on your attempt to work together in an equitable way? Because this is where transparency comes in. And if you don't understand them, how can you explain them to your partner? And this is where I point out, this is where I can come into play. Because you may not need to understand them, but if you pull someone like myself into a room when you're having those sort of initial meetings with partners, I will ask those annoying questions. I will bring up these annoying things about, if you work with the University of Glasgow, I'm going to tell you exactly what that's going to involve. I can be that transparent lens for you, and I'm happy to do it. I'll come back to that continually as we go along. So then let's think moving from the structural inequalities into developing a research proposal. It's often a bit of a mad scramble. The call comes out, oh my gosh, this is the perfect fit for what we wanted, and you're really focused on kind of meeting that deadline and pulling things together. There's sometimes, depending on the nature of the call, maybe for an MRC applied global health, you do have a lot more lead time because those are set deadlines over the course of the year. NIHR has similar sorts of calls. But then there's real questions about, well, what's the best way to really do co-development of a research concept? You get everybody together and you start to bash out ideas, and if you're like me, you put them on Post-it notes up on the wall and reorganize them until they start to make some sort of sense. But is there money available to get everybody in a room together? Particularly in a global health context, you're working with low and middle income country partners who don't have general funds, discretionary budgets to get them here to the UK. And often we don't have enough money to do more than maybe a conference or two in discretionary budgets here. So where does that money come from to get you into a room together? There's also a question of time. It takes time to develop a grant proposal. I think it's fair to say that in a lot of cases, it will be the lead investigator who's doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the drafting and the writing and the editing and the budget development with the project coordinator. And so who has time to take that on, and what are the expectations of other team members? How much time do they have available? It is, in theory, I say, because I know about the challenges in the workload model, built into our academics' workload that they have time to develop research ideas, apply for research. That's part of their job. But I know what that means in reality. But for a lot of our low and middle income country partners, their time is not built and baked in like that. They're maxed out on teaching to an extent that's much higher than a lot of our even heavy teaching load staff are facing. And research is something that they attempt to squeeze in on the side, but if they don't teach, they don't get salary in a lot of cases because it's about whether or not they're in the classroom. And so taking a week to come to Glasgow to co-develop a research proposal, are they losing income because of that? So it's not just about time, it's also about money. There's real questions. If you have a large team working on a large NIHR proposal, you might be talking about 20 researchers and administrative staff and research and community professionals. Getting every single person on just a Zoom call together is a challenging feat. And if you don't know each other that well, that's when that kind of misunderstandings can happen. You make assumptions about, oh, well, they must not be here because it's not that important to them, when really their line manager told them, no, you have to be here instead, and they don't get to make choices like that because they might come from a much more hierarchical working culture. And so it's in that crush and that you're just trying to get it across the line. And it's really hard to do the meaningful, awkward conversations about money and everything else. So things often get let slide. Things like data and ethical issues. Are they being left to the last minute as you focus on the case for support? And you'll get to the data management plan once the case for support is done. But all of those sorts of elements become really important when it comes to equitable partnership. And also just in the quality of your overall research proposal, I'll say that too. And the question of, are you pushing things onto the back burner to leave it until you get the money? Because that is a recipe for disaster. This is where the time and effort comes in, because application processes and the way applications come together do not lend themselves to equitable partnership. So in the face of that, the things that are useful to have in the back of your mind and start to think about are really, to some extent, quite fundamental. Who is actually conceptualizing the research? Is it someone sitting here in Glasgow saying, well, I've got an idea and I need a location to try it out, so let me go find some people or partners in that location, but the research idea and your planned approaches are kind of set in your mind? Or are you making decisions within a team dynamic, which again takes a lot more time, a lot more effort, but really interrogate who is driving the questions that are framing your research and who is driving the approaches that you are using to answering those questions. There are lots of different kinds of knowledges in the world. And it's important, again, to take that step back about, because you think it's normal, might not be what other people think is normal. What's your team approach to authorship? You might think, well, that's not something you need to think about at the application stage, but actually it really is. In some countries where I have worked on collaborations, if there is any more than 4 co-authors on the paper, they can't count it for their internal promotion criteria. In other countries where I have worked, if they work for public institutions, they get, yeah, it's very annoying, less credit for the more authors there are on a paper. So they will always be pushing for less co-authors on a paper. That's before you even get into the disciplinary differences. In global health, you're generally speaking about interdisciplinary teams that are coming from a broad range of perspectives. And in the STEM fields, it's very common, 20, 30 co-authors on a paper, maybe hundreds if you're working in genetics. In the shape disciplines, 1, maybe 2 or 3 is fairly standard. So you don't just have that geographical distance between what you might think is normal. You have disciplinary differences as well. And if you don't bottom them out and you come and a team starts drafting up a paper and then people start to ask, why aren't I on that? Why are they on that? If you don't think about those things, about what those expectations are, and give people the chance to say, well, if I can't be on every paper, I'm not going to be able to be part of that. That has to happen at the application stage, not later on down the line. You know, that data management plan question. Who owns the data? Generally speaking, our standard collaboration agreement will say something about IP that is jointly developed will be jointly owned and blah, 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 blah. And that's fine in theory, but not if everyone can access it. Often the default will be, well, we'll store sensitive data on the OneDrive system here at the University of Glasgow, because that complies with GDPR and the UK's equivalent to GDPR, and we know it's secure. So how are your LMIC colleagues going to get access to that? Have you thought about whether or not you can set them up with affiliate status? Have you thought about how they're actually going to be able to get access to the data in order to be able to do the analysis? Or is the assumption slightly baked in that they won't need to, which is also problematic as well? So thinking about, well, if you need to resource data security, if you don't figure that out at the application stage, by the time you have the money, if it's not properly resourced and you haven't thought it through, it's too late then, and you've baked that unequal access to your data into your project plan. And I will always, if I'm reviewing an application, I'm always looking at the budget. You can wax lyrical about the University of Glasgow has amazing equality, diversity, inclusion policies, and of course we believe in equitable partnership, and of course we're going to include everybody in all of the decision making, and of course we're going to make sure there are opportunities for everyone to be able to travel to conferences. And then I go to the budget and there's no money for any of those things. There's money for 2 people from the University of Glasgow to travel to a conference, or there's money for, you know, 1 meeting with stakeholders. You have to make sure that your budget matches up with the aspirational language that's contained within the rest of your application. Is your money going where your mouth is? And it's important to think then as well about the development needs across the entire project. So one of the areas that I'm particularly passionate about, as people in this room may already know, is research management staff capacity strengthening. We benefit in the UK from a lot of professional opportunities for research development staff, for research support staff. There's the Association of Research Managers and Administrators. You know, there's broad connectivity for PhD students. We have large professional networks. For a lot of our colleagues in low and middle income countries, they don't have access to those kinds of resources. And it creates problems for them, both in terms of structural and institutional resiliency and capability to do the kinds of things they're expected to do. But also, when we think about research capacity strengthening, there is almost always a focus on, okay, well, we'll get some PhD students and we'll get some postdocs. Okay, but what about the administrative structures that are required to underpin the operations of that research? What about the IT systems that might be needed? What are the actual development needs in a broad sense to make sure that, yeah, maybe Glasgow will need to get less money for laptops to make sure that your teams in Tanzania have the IT dongles that they need to be able to dial into a Zoom call at the time that you want them to, because they don't have access to Wi-Fi outside their office, or they might not have reliable internet access. So again, maybe you have an IT budget that's unequally distributed, but it will be equitably distributed, and that's an important distinction. So making sure that you kind of fight against that pressure to push things through as quickly as possible and dedicate that time to really co-developing the concepts and the approaches and having those different conversations, understanding that everybody's time is going to be worth a different amount. And I don't mean monetarily. When you look at the budget lines, Glasgow staff will inevitably cost more than any single person in a low and middle income country. But that doesn't have anything to do with how much time they're expected to dedicate to different things and how much availability they have. And so making the mistake of absence being lack of interest is a big one. And constantly reevaluating what everybody thinks is normal. All those assumptions that get baked in at this point, you won't even realize they're there until the money starts flowing and people start saying, oh, I thought you meant this, when you never actually had a conversation about it. And so, yeah, then you get the money. Yay! I've seen quite a few proposals come back, actually, where people were kind of like, oh, right, we got the money, now we need to do it. And other people who were relieved to not have gotten the money. So I can understand it can go either way. But when we're talking about global health research, it is complex. You might be talking about clinical trials. You're definitely talking about personal data collection. You might be talking about needing to ship biological samples. You're talking about, possibly multicultural or multi-country consortia. And so there's a lot of effort that goes into getting that machinery going, the paperwork, and usually, people say, oh, we're going to have all that done in the first 6 months. No, you're not. You're definitely not. And so by the time you kind of get things going, that becomes a real source of stress, and making the machinery happen often gets in the way of reinterrogating and rethinking about how the research is actually going to happen. So you think about getting your collaboration agreement set up and your clinical trial approvals and your ethical approvals and figuring out how that's going to work. But you should also be thinking about the mechanics of the research itself. A lot of global health research has community involvement. It might be called patient involvement or patient group involvement, participatory patient involvement. It might be called community engagement, it might be called stakeholder engagement. It can be called a lot of different things. But it's important to think about, well, what are your entry points to those communities? And I use communities in the broadest sense. Your communities might be doctors that you're working with in hospitals. They might be nurses. They might be community health workers. They might be educators working in a school. They might be children. There are lots of different kinds of communities that this might be relevant to. But are you using the appropriate entry points? Do you know what they are? If you had those useful conversations at the beginning, hopefully you have some sense of what the appropriate mechanisms are to engage with the different groups that you want to. And when you're doing that engagement, being really careful about what you're promising you're going to be able to deliver. In a lot of cases, communities will have a track record of working with international global health research teams. And not all global health research teams work the same way. Some communities will have very negative experiences of researchers that come in, make all these promises, get their data, and then leave, and they never hear from them again. And so making sure you're being, again, this gets back to that transparency element. Don't promise people you're going to be able to completely overhaul the hospital system in their local area and make it easier for them to get health care. You're not going to be able to promise that. Be realistic about what you can promise and what the timelines for delivery are going to be. And thinking very clearly about what is in it for participants in your research, if they're joining focus group discussions, or if you want a sample of their blood as part of some sort of clinical trial. What is actually in it for them? Be transparent about that as well. Increasingly, funders are allowing financial compensation for people's time, but you should also be thinking more broadly about what can you offer the participants in your research. From a team perspective, it's useful to think about some of the boring practicalities about communication. I worked in a team that had people in the United States, Tanzania, New Zealand, and the UK. And we would rotate our fortnightly Skype calls so that each person would take a turn being up at a really unfortunate hour. But often that's not the case. Often the default is it will be something that is, assumed to be convenient for everybody. But are you actually aware about what is safe and convenient? So for example, you might think 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you're working with colleagues in Africa. That's a good time for a regular meeting. Except there's a 2-hour, sometimes 3-hour difference to Malawi, which is where a lot of our global health research is focused. 3 o'clock here, it's 5 o'clock there. So you're already outside their kind of normal working period. But as well, it gets dark in Malawi at about 5:45 at night. And it's not safe to walk after dark in most cases. So you have now put people in a position where if they have to stay in the office to be on a Zoom call with you, it's not just that you're pushing them outside their normal hours of work. It might be you're pushing them into a scenario where they might need to put themselves in an unsafe scenario to get home afterwards. So thinking about how you're going to compensate for those sorts of things. So it might be that you do provide, Wi-Fi dongles, so people who might not have reliable internet at home could make that call at home instead. You might think about, just changing the time of your call to be a little bit more accommodating of a variety of different perspectives. But it's important to have those conversations and to be aware of those differences. And a big one is kind of how you communicate as well. Again, if any of you have worked a lot with African partners, you'll know WhatsApp is how almost everybody communicates all the time. There's a lot that the kind of separation of your personal phone number doesn't tend to exist. Everything is on WhatsApp. Of course, that creates a lot more connectivity between team members and can give you real-time troubleshooting. I've seen it work really well in circumstances like that, particularly, again, during periods of travel restrictions during the pandemic, where someone out in the field in rural Tanzania could WhatsApp a researcher here at Glasgow because they ran into an issue and it gets resolved immediately. It also, though, means that people have your personal phone numbers. We often have colleagues who will get appeals for money. They may also, you may also end up in dynamics that are bullying, especially if there are gender or hierarchical power structures that you need to be aware of. So being aware of those differences and the norms in different contexts becomes really important. But the research stage is where you reap what you sow. And so that local context is critical. It's useful to bear in mind you might not be that critical. We learned that during the pandemic as well. That feeling of, well, I need to be there in person when the recruitment is happening, when the analysis is happening. And it turns out you probably don't actually. So thinking about when your presence is actually the most useful, it can be in the early stages for those difficult conversations. It might not need to be during the research delivery phase. And then, of course, you start to think about as you are winding up the kind of research proper, did you deliver any impact? Most global health research, if it's done well, hopefully, will deliver some kind of impact. But who decides what impact is? Does it look like a very nice photo in the Graham Carr Building Library of the Innovation Team of the Year? Or does it look like a photo taken in much less glamorous circumstances, which is a room in rural Uganda where they are checking fecal samples for schistosomiasis infection? I can tell you it was a very fragrant room. But every person who brings in their samples finds out on that day whether or not they have schistosomiasis. And for the community, that is a massive amount of impact. That was the benefit to them of participating in the study. The researchers got that access, but they found out whether or not they got schistosomiasis, and if they did, they got treatment to go along with it. And so thinking about what is impact in this context and who does it matter to? Yeah, of course, it's great to get a ref impact case study. But are we thinking about those promises that were made to the community, about what we were going to be able to deliver to them, to practitioners, to policymakers, all of those people who hopefully have been involved in your project right from the very beginning? And thinking about different kinds of impact are important to different people. And when we get into back to those structural inequalities, who gets to decide that is really important. But you should be having a holistic view of what impact looks like. And so thinking about your dissemination and how you share those outputs, it's important to think about the equity that's inherent in that as well. Open access publishing, it's generally increasingly, it is a ref requirement, it's increasingly becoming a funder requirement. But it's a tricky one, because on one hand, it makes those publications available and open to any of our LMIC colleagues who may not have access to the journals if they're behind a subscription wall. However, if open access is becoming the expectation, for a lot of our LMIC colleagues, if they're not working in a Global North team with Global North funding, they can't afford to pay open access fees to make their articles open access. So there's inequity baked into that as well, and it's important to keep that in the back of your mind. Who is your audience? I'm hoping there's a recognition that if you're writing an academic publication or presenting at an academic conference, your language and the way you present information is different than if you're Dan Hayden giving a presentation at a hotla in Botswana. It should be different. Messaging should be tailored and appropriate for the audience that you're talking to and with. And it comes back to keeping the promises that you made. If you told people, we are going to come back and provide your local clinic with posters about how you can minimize your risk of this disease, you need to be able to do that. You need to be able to say to policymakers, yeah, you had this question, we have the answer for you. We were able to get that, or we weren't, but we found the answer to this other question that we think is maybe related. And the participants, are they finding out whether or not they have some sort of illness? Are you going to be able to treat them? What promises did you make, and are you going to be able to keep them? And again, this gets back to that budget question. Did you put in money to do the dissemination, to do the production of the materials, to do the community engagement work? Have you built in the time? All that time that you spend in the machinery of setting up the project, often it's much more common for projects to end up with money left over at the end, but they don't have time. And the knowledge exchange and those bits are often what gets pushed out. And so then you think, okay, well, I'll get a GCAP award or an Impact Accelerator Account award to go do those bits later. But of course, there's no guarantee that you're going to get that. So making sure you're thinking about that, can you budget it in terms of time and money all the way along, and not just leave it as when the analysis is done, then we'll go back. Often that's too late. And thinking about who's responsible for delivering it. In a project, thinking about who are the people that a policymaker wants to engage with. Probably not a PhD student. So how do you factor that in? When you think about community members, is it likely to be, maybe depending on the dynamics in the local context, someone who's female, someone who's male? All of those things will need to come into play. So thinking carefully about how you're going to approach those questions and those issues, all the way back at the application stage, all the way through the research stage, will come back here as well. And so a few odds and ends. I wanted to raise the question of language, because I think that's something that doesn't get a lot of attention. If you've ever spent a lot of time in an environment where everyone else is speaking a language that is not your native language, you speak it. If you speak it, you'll understand, but it's exhausting. The amount of processing you have to do, both to listen, to not just pick up on the literal translation, but the meanings and the connotations and the body language, and then try to formulate a response. And if you're in a room where there are 5 or 6 people and there's lots of side conversations going, it's a really challenging environment to be in. And for better or for worse, English is the language of research, of science, but research more broadly. And so when we look at a lot of global health projects, the language that everyone is using is English. But English is probably not going to be everybody's first language. And how much more effort is it for everyone for English not being their first language, how much more effort does it take them than it might take you to understand a concept, to participate meaningfully in a conversation, to present in front of people, which, a lot of native English speakers don't like to present in front of people. But all of those things layer on top of each other. And so are you giving enough time and space for people to process information and engage in a meaningful way? Are you assuming everybody's understanding what you're talking about? Because they're nodding along, but everyone knows that, if someone says something to you, you kind of get, what? And then they say it again, I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear you. The third time, you definitely don't want to admit that you still don't understand what they meant. And in a large group, it's intimidating. And so thinking about how language intersects with the power structures within your own team and people's ability to fully participate is a really important thing. I've talked a little bit about how important everybody's time is and the pressures that are on people. And that intersects with finances as well. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago, and we had a presentation from someone who was a representative of the South African Research and Innovation Managers Association. And she talked about, people's agency and their ability to say no is very different in different contexts. It's very rare for a Global South institution to say they don't want to be part of this big initiative that you are putting in a funding application for. So she was very frank about the fact that people will say yes. That doesn't mean they have the time and the headspace to really actively participate, especially at the application stage where there's not even any money involved for them yet. You want them to donate their time when they've got 15 other things pulling on them. And so as transparent as you want to be, those structural inequalities still impact people's agency to be able to, they will probably say yes. And if once the money is there, but asking at the application stage for people to donate their time is a really big ask, much more so for our low and middle income country partners than it is to ask someone else in the UK. And at the end of the day, things, I say probably will go, they will go wrong. Oh, things will go wrong. It is the nature, not, of interdisciplinary research, of international research, of research full stop, of life. Things will go wrong. And so it's important to be honest with yourself and with your team when things do go wrong. Also important to be kind to yourself. Like I said, there's no one right way to do this. This is not an endpoint where if you do all of these things, you will be certified good at equitable partnership. It is the striving that is important. It's the trying. It's the continual reevaluation and working towards being a better version of what you did before and learning from those mistakes. So thinking about, keeping those lines of communication open, taking the time and the effort to build trust so you can have the conversations that you need to about, did you really, did you get everything that we just talked about in there? Why don't we grab a coffee and go through things in a little bit more detail? All of those sorts of things take time and effort. And if you want to be striving towards equitable partnership, they're really important. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, this is all well and good, but, the time and the money to do that piece of preparatory work is not really available anywhere, except it is with GSID small grants. So the Glasgow Centre for International Development has a small grant scheme that is available. It will be launching in early 2025 for projects that start in August and last for 12 months, we think. The reason I say we think is because there is a possibility that we have no idea how big or small this possibility is, that we will receive a block award of external funding from the UK government, in which case we would use that money to fund these awards, but that has a slightly different timeline. It would be starting in April and running for 12 months after that. One way or another, this call will be going live. But you can ask for up to £30,000, and the idea is it's to build new partnerships. To develop the beginnings of things, to develop strong foundations, build the trust, have those in-person meetings, learn about the context that you need to then really put together a convincing and equitable case for funding from NIHR, who often like to see evidence of co-development, or MRC Applied Global Health, or you've got the pilot data that Wellcome might expect you to have. So it's a chance to create trust, but it's also a chance to grapple with some of these issues. And the picture that's up there is me and 5 of my colleagues mapping out our funding proposal using some of this funding in Tanzania last year. So hopefully you too can get some of this money and map out a research proposal of your own in Post-its on a wall in a very overheated room in Tanzania. The conversation we did not have was about everybody's thermal tolerances. There was a wide variety. So please contact me if you have any questions about any of this, or you have concerns, or you'd like me to join team meetings and poke at these issues, because I can also understand that sometimes it is uncomfortable for you to say, we need this kind of evidence of expenditure. But I can say, I know all the background. I'm happy to explain what is needed. And I don't do favors. This is, if you ask me to join a team meeting, if you ask me to talk to your partners, if you have a question for me, that's not me doing you a favor. You don't need to feel bad about asking. I've been banging on about this now for a while because I got a lot of people, I just need a small favor. It's not a favor. It's exactly what I'm here to do. My experience and expertise is at your disposal in this way, and I would really encourage you to draw on it, even if it is, to poke at some uncomfortable things. I'm more than happy to do that, and it's part of why I'm here at the university. So with that, I think we have some time for questions if anybody has any. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary. And through the online thing, it doesn't allow questions.
Okay.
Really
That's too bad.
So it would just be questions from people.
Okay.
Yeah.
That could be a very small Q&A. But if anybody online has questions, send me an email, please. I'm very responsive on email, so ping me a message. Does anybody in the room have questions? It's a lot of information to take in, so you can also mull and come back to me later.
I was thinking about the more investment in the application stage is obviously what is good practice.
Yeah.
And then that kind of crushing blow of it not being funded. So that kind of, it's not really managing expectations, but it's, how, in your experience, is everyone on the same page that this is a kind of a speculative, it's a bit of a gamble?
Yes. I think we can do a better job generally, and certainly when I have engaged with, for example, colleagues at Ifakara Health Institute and Kilimanjaro Clinical Research Institute, I think there is a perception that we're really good at grant applications. And then when you tell them what our actual success rate is, which is generally, depending on whether or not we're on a good streak, between 10 and 15%, they're shocked to learn that. And I think it is part of, as well, that transparency element of being really clear that really good proposals still sometimes, a lot of times, most of the time, don't get funded. The only difference is if you don't apply, you definitely won't get funded. And we're trying to do better at particularly some of these big calls that require, complex consortium and interdisciplinary international teams, thinking more critically about, okay, if it's not successful, are there elements we can pull out and turn into other successful grants? And we've seen that happen. So I was supporting an ESRC application that the feedback was amazing. Like it became really clear reading through the feedback that they were splitting hairs on who to fund, and it was a very strong proposal. But it wasn't successful in the end, but we were able to take it and repackage it and then successfully apply for British Academy funding. The entire application didn't work, but a component of it did fit what British Academy was looking for. So sometimes it's also about all that effort that you put in, even if you're not successful, it's not wasted. And it still can form the basis of, you still had all those conversations. You're still well positioned for whatever maybe the next opportunity is. So it's important to get that balance right between don't want to be negative, but we're probably not going to get it. And even if we don't get it, these conversations are not in vain. It's a tricky line to walk. And it's demoralizing if you go through a string of rejected grant applications. Resilience, particularly for international teams to maintain that connectivity and keep the relationships live when funding is as difficult to come by as it is, it's a real challenge. Yeah, I don't have a silver bullet on that one.
How do you get around the WhatsApp issue? Because I've seen a lot of people in the global south, WhatsApp seems to be the professional way to communicate, and they add you to WhatsApp group. You're added to WhatsApp groups. Yeah. And you get messages, all the time.
Yeah. It's a personal choice. I mean, For me, I don't like having work on my phone. I don't have Teams on my phone. But obviously, concepts of what work-life balance looks like are very different in different places. And WhatsApp is more convenient for a lot of people, and you kind of have to make your own decisions both within your team. Some of the best practice guidance that was developed as part of sustainable and equitable research was about coming up with an agreed, okay, we're going to set up a project WhatsApp group. No messages after 10 p.m. Other principles of engagement that you might want to decide on. I mean, it can get challenging. Do you want to tell people that it's work only, no personal things? For some people, it's those personal relationships that are how the trust is built to do the professional things. So I'm not going to stand here and say, here's how you should do it. I can really only stand here and say, you will be in circumstances where there probably will be a pretty strong expectation on you that you will. And you have to weigh up those decisions for yourself about what you're comfortable with and what you're comfortable with doing to deliver the research, most effectively. But it is a very challenging space to navigate. And, certainly that's a big area where what everyone thinks is normal is very, very different. I don't like giving my personal phone number out to anybody. Meanwhile, I get messages from, hotels in Tanzania that I'm trying to book an event at. They say, this, and this, but contact me here on WhatsApp for, more conveniently. And all I can think is, but that's your personal phone number. But it's completely normal in that context, so, yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along, and hopefully that was a little bit useful.
Yeah, thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Megan.
Don't know if
Strange.
I don't know if that turns off on its own. Not really sure how it works.
I think we need to reset. It says restart. It's strange with the Echo Zoom because we did another seminar here and you don't fully know who's there and you can't ask questions, which is such a shame because
I guess it's more like a live stream than interactive. Yeah.
So I think
It's not like a webinar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We don't have the facility to use Zoom in here because all the rooms are Claris pairs and we tried to get one in the art, but they're just all being used for teaching.
Oh.
But that was really good. Thank you.
Was that what you were hoping for?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Never really sure if you hit the brief or not, but
No, it's really good.
see you. Okay. On to the next one.
And how are you doing?
Good. I'm kind of in there's sort of the last push before the Christmas break. It's this weird thing where people are trying to finish stuff. People don't want to start stuff because, so it's yeah. What about you? How are things? Have you got teaching and?
I start the next semester, so it's going on.
So you're not in the marking?
No. I'm transitioning to the online Rise stuff, so it's a lot of work transitioning. We're getting there. Do you go back? Do you still have family in Canada?
I do, but it is Canada, but I'm not going back. I'm not going back this year. I was back over the summer, and it's at Christmas. It's so expensive. So
whereabouts is it?
I'm from Newfoundland, which is very, very east coast, but it's also part of. Yes. It's also part of why it's expensive because people live on this coast. You have to go via Toronto and then back 3 hours.